important news we're following right now, including in Iraq. It didn't take very long for Iraq to start unraveling without U.S. troops around to help hold the country together. More than a dozen attacks today across Baghdad, killing at least 65 people, hundreds injured, the new violence on top of growing turmoil within the Iraqi government. Now those who predicted this kind of crisis after the U.S. military withdrawal are tempted to say, I told you so. CNN's Arwa Damon is joining us now from Baghdad. Arwa, you learned about a top U.S. official, a top general, if you will, visiting Iraq today in the midst of all of this. What's going on?
That's right, Wolf. And the Office of Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki putting out a very brief statement saying that General Ray Odierno, the Army Chief of Staff, but also, if you'll remember, a man who has done multiple tours here in Iraq, met with the Prime Minister. They were discussing equipping, training the Iraqi security forces. One can also only assume that politics came into play, given the crisis that the government is in right now. And that is really underscored by the violence that we saw taking place here, because the Iraqi government is never going to be able to get a grip on violence if it can't get a grip on politics. Today, an example of that. It is a tragic but all too familiar routine in Baghdad, cleaning up carnage. Pools of blood, the burnt-out shells of vehicles, streets strewn with broken glass. The explosions that rocked the Iraqi capital Thursday were painfully reminiscent of Iraq's dark days. 16 of them came during the morning rush hour. The targets, mostly civilians. This is Iraqi's worst nightmare. The unraveling of a fragile political compact hard on the heels of the U.S. troop withdrawal. The government seems to be collapsing like a deck of cards. The Sunni Vice President, Tariq al-Hashimi, is wanted on charges of terrorism and now being protected by the Kurds in the semi-autonomous region of Kurdistan. The Vice President's Sunni-backed Iraqi bloc says the allegations against him are politically motivated. It sees a Shia-dominated government going after Sunni opponents. Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, a Shia who is close to Iran, is demanding the Kurdish authorities surrender al-Hashimi, but they haven't. Thursday's attacks are widely thought to be the work of al-Qaeda in Iraq, which has always tried to stoke Sunni-Shia tensions. Terrorism in Iraq relishes a political vacuum.
The political process is not only fragile, but it is downhilling, in fact, because of intimidation of the partners. It means they will justify their criminal activities, that the solution is not in the political process, the solution is something else.
I'm sure prior to the withdrawal, you yourself, other members of Iraqiyya were warning the Americans that this was going to happen.
So many times you warned the American that both the security and the political situation is so fragile, so things should be not only gradual, should be responsible. Unfortunately, no one listened.
Just how fragile. This man at the scene of one bombing in a Shia neighborhood yells, "This is because of Alawi and Hashimi," blaming the leader of the main opposition party and the vice president. In the city of Fallujah, a former stronghold of Sunni insurgents, hundreds took to the streets chanting in support of al-Hashimi. Al-Maliki is an American agent, they yelled. Iraq on the edge, a far cry from the democracy Washington wanted to leave behind. And Wolf, it's also a far cry from the democracy and the nation that Iraqis thought the U.S. would be bringing them when they initially toppled Saddam Hussein back in 2003. Days like today, with this sheer level of violence, watching the Iraqi government appearing to crumble like a deck of cards, that most certainly does not give Iraqis a lot of optimism for their future.
It's so disheartening. Arwa, you and I spoke yesterday. We reported that the CIA director, General David Petraeus, made a surprise visit to Iraq, presumably trying to ease this crisis. And as you say, General Ray Odierno, a former U.S. commander in Iraq and now the Army Chief of Staff, he's there right now. The White House says Joe Biden, the vice president, has been on the phone with President Talabani and others. Here's the question, and I'm anxious to get your assessment. How much influence does the United States have in Iraq right now?
Not enough, Wolf. It most certainly can't force these political parties, the leadership, to a table, and most certainly cannot
force a negotiation on them anymore. And if anything, it's important to note that perhaps amongst many of the Iraqi political blocs, there would be something of a backlash should the U.S. try to force them to come to any sort of a deal, because it's important to remember that this last so-called power-sharing deal that brought this current government together was brokered by the U.S. and it ended up being a complete sham. Iraqis don't have a lot of trust in America right now. We've been talking to members of the Iraqi bloc quite a bit over the last few days. That's the vice president's bloc, Sunni-backed bloc, and they are wondering why it is that the U.S. makes the decisions that it does, backs the individuals that it does. So on the one hand, the U.S. does not have the influence it used to. On the other hand, Iraqis do not necessarily want America to get involved at this stage.
Arwa Damon on the scene for us. As I say, a very, very disturbing, disheartening development only days after U.S. forces leave Iraq. And remember, still 17,000 Americans in Iraq, half diplomats, diplomatic support, half security contractors. They are in danger right now. We'll stay on top of this story for our viewers.